Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and with me, as always, is our Vice President of Research, Derek Cohen. Derek, it's been a couple weeks. There's been a lot going on. I'm really excited about our guest today, really excited about the subject that we're going to be talking about, which we will get to in a little bit. But, of course, we always like to start the show off with something a little fun, some hot takes from the last couple of weeks. Well, you know, and we get into sports. You're a sports fan, so we get into sports. Obviously, not everything has to be about politics and policy. But the NFL schedules came out, and so now's a good time to assess whether our teams here in Texas, the Cowboys, of course, and the Texans, but your teams as well, how they're going to do for next year. Just quick question. So the question is hot take. What is the over/under on wins, or let's say the over/under is 10 for wins for the Cowboys and the Texans? What are you taking, the over or the under on that?
For 10? Ooh, I don't know. I think I can't say they've improved in the offseason, so I would probably go ahead and give them, I'd hammer that over, but then when it came to postseason wins, I would probably, you could set it at 0.5. Give me the under on that one.
On both the Texans and the Cowboys?
Oh, Texans and the Cowboys.
A lot of guys
I keep forgetting the Texans are a team.
Folks are hot on the Texans this year. They got the quarterback. They've added one of the top receivers in the league. Real hot on the Texans, winning the division.
It's one of those things where works in progress. I think it's moving in the right direction, but I'll believe it when I see it.
So now we'll go to your team, the Detroit Lions, right?
Steelers, actually.
Steelers, okay.
I'm Lions adjacent. Lions curious.
Okay, yeah. So what do you how do you think Steelers and Lions are going to do this year?
I think Steelers, much like the Cowboys. Tomlin's streak of making the playoffs and then getting absolutely demolished in the first round, I think will still be undefeated. But I do think that both the Lions and the Steelers both had really good drafts. I'm really excited to see what the Lions do, because they definitely strengthened during the draft in free agency as well. But I do think that it's going to be still kind of a bit of an uphill battle. They pulled
new
one
quarterback. Didn't they get a new quarterback? They got the kid from Chicago, right?
What are you talking about?
They got the whoever was the starter for Chicago for the last couple of years. The kid from Ohio State. I can't remember his name, but they got him as like a backup now.
Oh yeah, I'm like sitting there going, I was like, Goff just like is now getting like $1 billion a game or whatever. I don't know how they got that under the cap, but yeah, his extension was absolutely massive.
I don't know why I'm totally blanking on his name.
Yeah, it's escaping me too. That's why I'm moving past.
Well, Jerry Jones says the Cowboys are all in, quote, all in this year, but of course everybody's on a 1-year contract, so this is a rebuilding year. So even though they won't say it out loud.
Like what, the fifth rebuilding year in a row? Or?
Well, it must be because they're not signing Dak to a long-term contract, which is the hugest, the biggest red flag. They're not signing any of the coaches to more than a year contract.
Well, learn from my experience as a beleaguered Steelers fan is that once a particular we'll say epoch in a team is over, the Big Ben era specifically, in with the Steelers. Once it's over, you just got to rip that Band-Aid off. You can't bleed it out for another, especially because he was late to retire anyway. But you can't just bleed it out on that same model over and over. And a lot of people translate that as, Tomlin needs to go or something like that. I'm actually fairly bullish on him, but there needs to be a full-scale recommitment to the redevelopment of the team as opposed to, we just need to catch the Big Ben lightning in a bottle.
The hot take on the Steelers, I hear, is that they're a victim of their own success. They're always in that kind of 9 to 10 win. And so they're not a great team and they don't go very far in the playoffs, but then they also aren't bad enough to get the really good draft picks.
Right.
And so they're always kind of stuck, and then they can't get rid of a guy who's winning. He's going over 500 every year, so they can't move away from Tomlinson. So anyway, all right. Well, we're all excited about football because football, it's Texas and anything that lets us talk about.
Did you
football.
see actually interesting thing about both of our teams? Did you notice that they came out with the new, now that NIL's a thing? They're bringing back the EA Sports NCAA football.
We could spend a whole other show talking about how excited I am about.
Did you see the cover though?
No.
It's Quinn Ewers and Donovan Edwards.
Well, fantastic.
Michigan and Texas.
Yeah. All right. Well, the Blue Bloods are back. All right. The other hot take I want to talk about today, because it is May 16th, and May 16th, according to the people who decide all of this, is National Barbecue Day, which there's only one real barbecue, which is Texas barbecue. So I don't know why it's a national barbecue, but anyway.
National Texas barbecue.
Barbecue hot takes. Do you have a favorite barbecue? Do you have a sauce versus no sauce, or any hot take about barbecue for the folks out there as they're deciding where they're going to go today?
I celebrate diversity and inclusion in all my barbecue preferences. But I will say, and this is probably the most controversial barbecue take that I have, is that everybody says, "Oh, Franklin's is the best in town," and I'm sympathetic to that argument. The problem with Franklin's, though, is the fact that if you go there just as a civilian, it takes you 3 hours to get through the line. My hot take is essentially that you go to Style Switch, the one up on Lamar.
Mm-hmm.
That's 20 minutes, and I would say we're debating at this point between a 98 and a 97.
It's very strong, and I've taken to I get outside of Austin fairly often, and that's one of the things I always try to do is try to find whatever the local hot barbecue place is, in whatever small town, big town, wherever it is that I go. The most recent one I went to was in Houston, not small town, obviously.
This place called Rudy's. You ever heard of it?
It's Pokey Joe's. No, is Truth Barbecue. That's the one. That's the one that our fellow colleague Sam Pohl, who is between him and Eric, our marketing director, are the resident aficionados of barbecue, and that's one that he gave me, and it was fantastic.
And they're not just aficionados; they're also practitioners.
Absolutely. They are the president of the fan club. Okay, Speaking of fan clubs, we get to my favorite portion of the show, which is the promotional side, the shameless promotions. Of course, I always talk about our newsletter, The Post. It's a weekly newsletter. It comes out on Thursdays. It's got exclusive information. It's got fun stuff about Texas barbecue and football and whatever else, but it also has a rundown of everything the Texas Public Policy Foundation is working on and all the big issues of the day, and kind of our hot takes and our research and various op-eds and things like that, and tons of video that you can watch as well, including this podcast. And I think now Jefferson, our fabulous producer here, told me that TPPF now has, I think, 14 podcast products, or 14 different series of video series. Some of them are sporadic, others are more regular, like our podcast, but we now have 14 different programs that we're producing, including the Sherry Sylvester Show and Sweet Tea and some of these others that are starting to build followings. Our venerable CEO has a podcast that he does called Policymakers with some of the bigger names in Texas. So that's pretty fantastic that we built the studio, didn't really know what we were going to do with it, and now we have 14 different products.
I was about to say, we're like one step away from Jefferson running this entire operation like a Twitch live
He's already begging me for new space. He's saying that the studio space isn't even enough.
It's like, oh man, you see what they're going to set the marginal tax rate at? What do you think, chat? Put it down in there. Let us know what you think. Hammer that like and subscribe.
Love it. All right. Okay. And now for the real reason we're here is to talk about the public policy and politics that drive Texas. And of course, this week we have talked about it, Derek, several times on the show coming up. We finally had the hearing in the higher education. The Texas Senate Higher Education Committee had the hearing discussing how public universities are enforcing the DEI ban. But that wasn't the only issue that they talked about. They also talked about all of the various protests and things that are going on campus and the rise of anti-Semitism on campus, as well as several other issues. And so we wanted to have a higher education expert come and talk to us about that. And so we're very, very excited to have Jonathan Pidluzny, who is the Director of Higher Education Reform at the America First Policy Institute. This is actually the first time we've had somebody from AFPI on, so we're very excited to have you. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so we've talked about DEI, obviously, in Texas and other states like Florida, and it certainly has, what states are doing to push back against the rise of DEI in higher education over the last 10 years really has kind of come on fairly strong in the last couple of years. And you've been tracking this, and you've been watching this, the rise of states starting to push back against this kind of thing. Well, what's your overall take in how Texas has responded to the issues on campus?
Yeah, so I think SB 17 is the best piece of legislation that's been passed at the state level. There's considerable interest around the country in replicating it. So what SB 17 does, as most of your listeners probably know, is it dismantles the highly ideological DEI offices that do mandatory trainings and that really coordinate DEI efforts throughout the entire university. Then it forbids the use of DEI screens in hiring, and it prohibits any mandatory DEI training. But it doesn't reach into the classroom. It doesn't affect faculty research, and it certainly doesn't affect student groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a really important distinction, is especially because some of the criticism is, this is this is telling teachers what to teach, or this is telling teachers that they can't talk about certain subjects like, the Holocaust or slavery and those kinds of things. And that's not remotely true. This is really about the programs outside of the classroom that really have to do with student groups or with faculty and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it really has to do with whether or not radical DEI administrators can use the university to re-engineer society, right? And that's their goal. And they tell us that's their goal, right? If you look at the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, they're very clear that this is an offshoot of critical race theory. They cite Derek Bell, they cite Kimberly Crenshaw, they cite Ibram X. Kendi, and they say we need to use the university to dismantle systemic oppression and to change the way people think, right? And so there's no reason why public funds should be paying for institutions to transform American society and really re-engineer it away from traditional American values.
Well, and Derek, I mean, you heard it there from an outside onlooker. Texas has the best law in the state or in the country. So we just, drop the mic right there and walk off.
Well, there's always additional good to be done. But I think the important thing that the natural experiment that this creates is Texas is one of the states that have passed this law, and other states have passed similar law. I would agree with Jonathan's assessment that ours is likely at the top. But the important thing to remember here is if you look at states where the opposite have done, or there has been no action at all, or there's been this DEI growth on autopilot, those are the ones you're seeing with these radical encampments. This is what you're seeing at the University of Wisconsin. This is what you're seeing at Columbia. This is what you're seeing at almost any school in the California system. Mm-hmm. And that's because this is the kind of radicalism that is fostered by these programs. And there's a bit of disingenuity there when it comes to how those were discussed, even at the hearing on Tuesday, because you saw them basically saying, "Oh, this is providing a safe space for students of color. This is providing an alternative for this, that, or the other." But to Jonathan's point, this has nothing to do necessarily with anything that is part of the actual academic focus. Mm-hmm. A whole bunch of the anti-SB 17 folks were saying, "Oh, it's been overinterpreted. The mass layoffs that you saw at, like, say, the University of Texas system, is because people are too scared to implement this in anything but an over-the-top way." When the thing is, the only people that have overinterpreted it are actually the people that oppose it, thinking that it's going to tear down absolutely every sort of, we'll say structure committed towards equity that they self-diagnose. But in actual reality, what it did was, again, just get rid of the stagnant bureaucracy.
So that's, and you heard that yesterday in the hearing. You heard testimony from students who were upset that they had gotten rid of the program, saying, I never would have come to the University of Texas if they didn't have DEI programs, and kind of this over the top that the University of Texas or A&M or wherever doesn't have anything to offer if they don't have the quote unquote safe space for the transgender students or what have you. So let's get into the hearing. There was invited testimony. Obviously, they had called in the chancellors from the various universities. Jonathan, your thoughts on what you heard yesterday, and is there? Do you think that they satisfied the requirements in the law, or did you hear things that maybe concerned you?
Well, so I think the first thing to note is how pervasive DEI is. And we know that now that there are some figures attached, right? So the UT system, right, they eliminated 311 full and part-time positions. And so that just tells you how much DEI activity there was at those campuses. That includes 21 DEI offices that were closed, over 600 contracts were canceled, and total savings in the $25 million range. So I think that's a great start. And I think it demonstrates that presidents are taking the problem seriously. But I think that DEI is so pervasive, right? It's insinuated itself into how we hire faculty, how we evaluate faculty, how we evaluate staff and administrators, how we think about general education. So I think there's a lot more to do, but I think the hearings demonstrated that there's been a good start and a good faith effort to make a start.
Yeah, one of the insiders I talked to who watched it yesterday said cautious optimism, I think, is at least that at the very least the chancellors knew their audience. They knew who they were talking to and what those folks maybe wanted to hear. But there was also, like you said, there were real stats to back that up in terms of the positions that they had terminated and the offices that they had closed. But you also characterized it as a good good start. What more do you think, and this doesn't have to be specific to any one school or whatever, but where do you think this is going? I mean, this is the first start, which is we have the ban in place. We have schools that are reacting, responding. It looks like they're taking it as seriously as they should. But where do we need to go with this? What's kind of the end result? What may be the next phase that maybe, a legislature in another state or maybe Texas could take to ensure that we're getting the results that we're trying to get as a result of this legislation?
Yeah, so I think the next thing we have to ask ourselves is, what have they been doing with $25 million worth of personnel and programming for the last 10 years? Right. And you have to start removing everything that they've built. Right. And so I think the first place to look is going to be those policies having to do with how you assess faculty, how you hire faculty, how you assess academic administrators, how you hire them, because it takes a long time to change some of those policies. So I would go through those policies. And then the other thing that boards are going to have to scrutinize is whether a DEI office was essentially renamed at some of these universities. Right. Maybe it became the multicultural office or the office to support underprepared students or first-time college goers, and really make sure that they're not doing DEI under a different name. And so that's going to take a lot of work.
And Derek, that was really the impetus for these hearings, to have them so early in the year, because we've really just started. We're only 4 months into the interim, 4 or 5 months into the interim, and already this is a very significant hearing, and it was because I think the sense of urgency grew because even as early as late last year and then into this year, there were news reports of people of faculty who said they weren't going to do anything but change the name, and that they were going to keep the people around, and they were going to essentially pursue the same programs. You had undercover video of faculty members at public universities in Texas basically saying that, not thinking that they were being recorded. And so, are you concerned, from your perspective, are you concerned that, maybe some of that's going on, and what does the next phase of this look like for Texas Legislature?
I wouldn't say that I'm concerned that it's going on. I would say that I'm absolutely certain it's going on. And that's because coming from academia, I can tell you, even back 10, 11 years ago, what people think it is now, it was back then. And so it's only grown since, right? And so knowing that there are folks trying to skirt the rules like that doesn't surprise me at all. Like I said, if I were a betting man, I'd put some money down on that. The bigger thing, though, specifically with these offices, is that a lot of folks on our side, and I would urge caution in this, a lot of folks on our side assume that once we get rid of DEI or ban CRT from elementary school or whatever the case might be, we just assume that the left-wing radicalism that attended that just disappears.
Right.
And that's their Gramscian long march through the institutions, basically shows that that's not.
To John's point, they were spending $25 million on it. That just doesn't go away, overnight.
No, that's like each year, that's like 5 head football coaches. But I say in jest. But all joking aside, so there is an ideological hegemony in the universities, and that's because a lot of time it's this, almost like this bourgeois ability to basically not engage in the broader, it's the cloistered academic environment. And so that's why when you're studying, Chicano studies or underwater basket weaving or any number of these majors that don't necessarily have a positive ROI, being able to cosplay revolutionary is that is the value that college brings to you. And so I think that the corrections that states like Texas, Florida, and others have made are a good step in that right direction, but this cultural Titanic is not going to swerve overnight. Jonathan,
Derek mentioned earlier about the protests that were happening on campus, and a lot of us can draw a pretty straight line from the DEI, the pervasion of DEI and its cultural influence on the campuses to those protests, where you have the silliness that came out of some of it, where you have people who are queers for Palestine, when of course if Hamas is not exactly the most friendly organization to gay people, that people draw a line from DEI and the CRT and seeing things as the oppressed and the oppressors to these kinds of protests, just protest to protest. Do you see the same thing? Do you see a connection there between what's going on campuses now and the encampments and all of that, and having been fomented by the spread of DEI on campuses?
Absolutely. I think you put it really well, right? Students, young people today in K-12, but then also at the university, they're primed to make snap judgments based on identity feature, right? So we're teaching kids to judge each other based on race and religious background first and foremost. What DEI does is it just sort of dumbs down critical race theory, intersectionality, post-colonial studies into there are good people and bad people. You're oppressed or you're an oppressor. If you're an oppressor, you're bad. If you're oppressed, you're a virtuous victim. And the only thing DEI can do with American Jews or with Israel is to code them as oppressors, right, by virtue of their economic and their political success. And so that makes Palestinians a strange kind of victim, even when Hamas is raping, torturing, kidnapping innocent civilians, right? And so you leave young people with this mindset that has essentially primed them to side with Hamas, right? So I think that's the atmospheric condition for this new left anti-Semitism we're seeing on elite campuses. But I think there are two other important ingredients. One of them is radical faculty, right? Like the pro-BDS anti-Zionist faculty that are in the Arab and Mideast studies programs and the gender studies programs. They're the ones who make these views respectable by bringing in speakers to talk about divestment from Israel, by their research that essentially calls for the elimination of Israel. So that's ingredient 2. And then 3 are the radical student groups and students who come to campus primed or viewing it as their purpose to change the conversation on Israel.
One of the more disturbing moments from the hearings yesterday was that a student that was asked to testify said that he was told by a faculty member that they were the next group of people to be put in the ovens. Very disturbing. He wasn't naming any names. I think that's probably the right thing to do, that he was going to go through the administration to identify that faculty member, and then there was going to be an investigation. But exactly to your point on that the faculty is as bad as some of these groups. Moving to the groups, have you done any, have you looked at, I know some, media organizations thankfully have started to look into it, but what have you seen in terms of the outside groups, how they're being supported, where the money's coming from, obviously the Soros groups and things like that. Have you seen any of that in your research?
Yeah, there's been some good research into this. I mean, who's funding groups like Students for Justice in Palestine? And one answer is it's Gulf money, right? That's been coming into the university for about 50 years now. And then the other is that it's Tides and Soros and a couple of other of the foundations on the left that are also ironically supporting the Biden administration. So they're really well funded, right? And I've been talking about what's happening on campus as an influence operation. You can go back, you can read the New York Times in the late 1970s, the early 1980s, and there's immense concern about oil money from the Gulf coming to university campuses and funding these new centers, right, for the study of the Middle East. The DeVos administration in 2019 issued a report, and they found that countries like Saudi Arabia view foreign gifts as a way to exercise soft power, right? The reason you're seeing this at elite campuses is because they've been targeted, right? These are the campuses that graduate students that go on to play important public leadership roles, right? And so you have this alliance of faculty, radical students, many of them who are immigrant or non-immigrant students who are visiting from the Middle East, and they're trying to change the way people think about Israel and Arab Palestinians.
So let me, real quick, Derek. I mean, so let me just put those two things together. Do you think that the soft power money, because you haven't even mentioned China, and that's obviously another big threat. Do you think that there's, on one side, you've got the faculty which believes in CRT and DEI. On another side, you've got, the outside influencers who are trying to, fund groups to be subversive on campus. Do you, not to put my tinfoil hat on here, but do you think those entities are acting in coordination, or do you think that they're just simply complementing one another because they happen to be on campus at the same time?
Yeah, so I think there's probably some coordination between the faculty who are espousing these, horrific views, vile views, and some of the student organizations, right? I think that's undeniable, but I think it's mostly that these groups are funded by different actors to advance the same end. And you just get a kind of like critical mass of exposure to these ideas between like DEI, which is just the atmosphere on campuses today, plus a small number of radical faculty. And I do want to make that qualification, right? It's not all faculty who espouse these views. It's a small number, but it only takes a small number, right? And there's been a couple of empirical studies now that show that where you have just even a small number, a couple of anti-Zionist faculty making these arguments, the level of student-on-student harassment targeting Jewish students goes up, right? So it only takes a small number, right, expressing these vile views and trying to make them respectable to really change the way students interact with one another.
Probably didn't surprise you, Derek.
No, not at all. But I do want to zoom out a little bit, because I think the idea of displaying this as an influence operation is fascinating. And Jonathan, I want to ask you, because this is the interesting thing about this. If you look at the nations where the Gulf money like officially comes from, if we're talking about, Qatar, say, or, is basically as a cat's paw of Iran, you don't need to go into the complexity of the Middle East, but these tend to be more authoritarian countries, and this is oversimplification, but what we would consider, at least in a vacuum or in the global setting, we would consider them essentially right wing. Yet we see them not only making bread but funding what we would consider here in America left wing. So my question to you then, zooming out, is the value of the influence operation less of the moving the Overton window, pushing people, into a more favorable view of these external entities? Or is it something more where the instability that it fosters is the goal? And I say that because let's say, if these Hamasniks actually got their way, Israel was eradicated, wiped off the face of the earth, and then they run what is now Israel as Hamas is running, the Gaza Strip, just basically just being, I wouldn't even say a promoter of terrorism, a practicing terrorist.
Yeah.
When wouldn't you think that the left would turn on them? So that makes me wonder that the instability is the actual target.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting idea. I haven't really thought about that. I'd go back. I would say, we know that these influence operations, if we want to use the term, we know that they date back almost 50 years now. And I think that early on, when they were funding chairs and centers for the study of the Middle East, they wanted to change the way that future diplomats, future foreign service officers viewed Israel and viewed the broader Middle East. And they wanted to, and this comes out in the Department of Education report, right? They wanted to change the narrative on Islam post 9/11. And when I say Islam, I mean political Islam, like jihadist Islam. So I think that it was like a battle for the minds of young, ambitious men and women and specific animus toward Israel. I think that's how it started. But if you look at the last few years, right, so when the DeVos administration at ED, when they initiated some compliance investigations into 12 campuses, actually, this led to a disclosure of gifts that should have been disclosed between 2014 and 2019, totaling something like $6.5 billion, right? Some of that money is from China, but the big offenders are Qatar and Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East anyway. And so I think when you're talking about that kind of money, maybe that is the long game, right? Foment division in society, make it more difficult for America to project power in a unified, behind unified principles and objectives.
And I want to get to, and I know you're still working on this, so I'm not asking you to violate any confidence here. But you're doing research on noncompliance in universities across the country. Do you have any early findings that you can share? Just sort of general observations as to how states like Texas and other states or universities in states like Texas, where you have these bans, how are they overall responding to the new laws?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing again a good faith start in states like Texas and Florida. I think where we're going to see where it's going to take longer to truly comply is with the policies. Sometimes a university policy takes a couple of years to get through all of the relevant committees and get all of the relevant approvals, right? And so we know that there are policies that still call for, at Texas universities, for example, an equity reviewer to approve the result of a search. Now, that's in the policy. Is it still being done? Well, it's hard to say, right? So practice could be changing, and the policy change may lag. And so I think what the governing boards should be asking their administrative apparatuses to do is to do a deep self-study, right? The way that you would do a self-study if you were pursuing institutional accreditation, right? So you should explain everything that you've done and then document what you've done so that there's a record that can be reviewed by the board, but also by the state legislature and by the state auditor if that's necessary.
And if you're not doing that, then that would obviously raise some red flags and suggest, well, maybe you are trying to hide something you are trying to just change the names and all of that, and you're not making a good faith effort to comply with the law.
Exactly. What's being asked is difficult, right? You're trying to undo the influence of several $100 million of spending on personnel, right, over the course of 10 or 15 years, maybe a little longer, right? And so making sure that you get everything is not an easy job. And you always have to remember the people who are charged with certifying to the legislature and to the state auditor that this has been done, they're a small group of busy professionals who are on the governing board. And there's an immense information asymmetry that they're up against, right? The university administration has an army of administrators, right? And your campus is full of activists who don't want to comply, right? And so given that asymmetry, I think it's going to take some time and some real will and some real pressure, right? And some real pressure from the state to ensure that it's a priority for provost, deans, student affairs administrators.
Well, if Texas is any guide, these lawmakers have a lot of really firm ground to stand on. TPPF did some polling last month, and we found that amongst Texans, 68% believe that all students should be treated the same at universities without special programs for Black, Hispanic, and gay students. Only 25% said that special programs should be created for them. And so the public, by almost 3-to-1 margin, is with the lawmakers on this. Are you finding that in other states? I haven't seen other polling in other states, but do you get the general sense that the public is with the lawmakers on this?
Oh, absolutely. Every time we do national polling asking whether there should be this sort of reverse race discrimination to quote unquote right historic wrongs, we see large majorities of Americans just don't like that general idea. The one thing that I would want to underline, and that I think folks on our side should be underlining is these measures are laser targeted at ideological DEI, right? Like DEI that is trying to use the university to engineer America away from its principles, right? But when it comes to supporting underprepared students, that's perfectly appropriate. And in fact, we should be doing more of it, right? So imagine if UT had been spending $25 million a year for the last 10 or 15 years to really help underprepared students in the summer before they matriculate, finish their general education math course, which we know is the single biggest barrier to progression and graduation, right? I mean, there are a whole bunch of good practices that this money could be supporting that would truly help underprepared students succeed.
Yeah, that's the one thing that we're not talking about, Derek, with higher ed is academics, and getting back to, what the purpose of the university is, which is, to discover wisdom, to discover knowledge, to hear, viewpoints from all over the map and to learn even about the ones that you don't agree with. Yes, you can learn about those and not have it be shoved down your throat. We're not saying you shouldn't hear those viewpoints, but that's really the purpose of education. And that kind of gets into another discussion. I'm not sure if they went that far, but we have certainly talked about on this show and in this building is students deciding that college isn't worth it for one reason or the other. The three big reasons being, number one, just the general cost. It's too expensive. Number two, even if you can afford it, you're not getting the education that you thought you were going to be getting, or having the experience that you thought you'd be having in terms of your academic progress. And then third, even if you do like your classes, and this is something that was told to us by one of our interns here at TPPF, she said, it's not like I don't like my classes. I still feel like I'm learning stuff, but there's this other element that's always there, and it's the indoctrination, and you constantly have to battle it, and you have to accept it, or you're not going to get a good grade. And so a lot of kids are deciding, that just seems like, I'm just going to go out into the workforce or go get a trade education or go to a community college and learn some marketable skills there and not have to deal with all this and get $40,000 in debt or more. What do you? I mean, all of that is having an effect on the campus lifestyle.
Absolutely, and I think that Jonathan brought up a really good point about the remedial instruction aspect, right? Back in my graduate days, I did a little bit of tutoring on the side. And what I saw, because I was teaching at that same time, I was teaching the undergraduate section of statistics, is that the kids that were going from one to the other, like, was declining over it. And again, this is, Cincinnati, it's a Midwestern school. So it was happening, there as well. And you saw that, I would say, that trend starting further and further back. Now, the problem is, to the point of this conversation, is what we're talking about is fundamentally just a lack of ability, or, I would say lack of ability, but a lack of, knowledge and training in that particular application in academics. The problem, of course, saying, okay, well, if 30% of an undergraduate body is not up to snuff on math or statistics, 30% of those who aren't are, say, African American, then clearly we need to couch any sort of remediation within something that recognizes. But the problem is there's no African American math. There's no African American statistics. It's just math. It's just statistics. Mm-hmm. And when you lard on all this other stuff, that's when you start losing the actual thread on the academic progress there.
Yeah. Jonathan, in addition to that polling that we did last month, we asked a couple of questions about whether or not they thought college was worth the cost. And it was interesting, we talked about it here on the show, there was an interesting dynamic where about half people, is about split, where they said, is there too much indoctrination? Is there too much politics on campus? Is there too much of the non-academic stuff on campus? And I think it was about 50% said, yes, there's too much of that going on, and I'm concerned about that. And yet we asked those same people, well, would you recommend college, like a 4-year college, to a student, a friend of yours or your own child? Would you recommend? And like 75% to 80% said yes, they would still recommend going to college. As someone who studies these things and sees all the problems on campus, do you kind of find your own self in that boat of, yeah, there's a lot of problems, but maybe we should still send people to, or maybe college is still a good return on investment?
Yeah. So we've seen the same thing, actually, right? In our polling, confidence in higher ed is plummeting. But at the same time, when you personalize it, most people say, yeah, I would want my kid to go to college. I think one of the reasons for that is that a degree still has a huge amount of value as a signal to the marketplace. So it may not be that what you're learning is preparing you to succeed, right? And the same polling will reveal that a whole bunch, I don't know what the number is off the top of my head, but significant numbers of Americans don't think that colleges are delivering the skills that business and industry need. Mm-hmm. And yet it's still an important signal, right? Because there are jobs that you won't be considered for if you don't have a 4-year degree. So when we push our polling a little further and we say something like, do you think our investment in higher education should be diverted increasingly to non-2 and 4-year programs, like workforce education programs, apprenticeships? We get 70, 80%. Like some of the strongest support we see is for diverting money outside of the traditional 2-4-year education system to other segments of the economy. And then when we also ask, does a lack of a college degree, does it constitute an artificial barrier to family sustaining employment? The perception, especially among minority Americans, is that it does, mm-hmm. right? That it's an artificial barrier. So I think that helps to explain what seems to be a contradiction, right? People want their kids to have degrees, even if their confidence in higher ed has fallen significantly.
Well, I have seen some polling similar to that question that you asked, and one of the interesting dynamics of it is whether or not the question of whether or not schools are doing the right thing or universities are teaching the right or teaching the right way or teaching the right subject matter. It seems almost to be tribal. There's a heavy Republican side that says they're not doing it the right way, and there's a heavy Democrat side that says yes, they are doing it the right way. Do you think that our tribal politics and our partisan politics are getting in the way of trying to find some kind of consensus on what universities should be doing?
Well, to some extent, there's definitely definitely partisan disagreement when it comes to how much confidence you have in higher ed. But I also think that one of the most exciting bills that's being considered on the Hill right now, it's actually called the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, right? And what it would do is it would allow students, low-income students, and up to about 250% of the federal poverty line, it would allow them to take their $7,400 in Pell money and study off campus in shorter term programs. Typically, these are logistics or health related or trades related. And that would open up a huge new opportunity for a lot of people who have trouble either finishing a 4-year degree or who don't get value from the credential that they graduate with, and that's a bipartisan reform, right? And so one that actually has a chance of passing in the next couple of years.
All right. Well, Jonathan Pidluzny, thank you so much for joining us today. He's the Director of Higher Education Reform at AFPI, the America First Policy Institute. So we're so thrilled that you're able to join us for this discussion today. We'd love for you to stick around in a segment we call, or a last section we call our 10-minute drill, where we go through some hot topics for the day. If you'd love to stick around, and we'll get your thoughts on a couple other issues.
Sounds great.
Awesome. All right. So our first segment in our 10-minute drill is Survey Says. We always look at new polling. Our folks that like the show love when we give them the polling and the inside scoop on what Americans think about issues. One of our favorite pollsters is RMG Research. That's Scott Rasmussen. And so he's got a lot of really good stuff that comes out every 2 or 3 days, and we love to peruse. One of the issues we haven't really talked about a whole lot in the last few weeks, Derek, just because so much has been going on, is immigration. And so he just was in the field asking about some immigration issues. And this was one that I thought was really interesting. He asked, if someone enters the United States legally, if someone enters the United States, legally, how long should they have to live in this country before they can apply for citizenship and vote in U.S. elections? Okay, so they're in the country legally. How long should it take for them to essentially become an American citizen? And about 80% said 6 years or less. Does that strike you as too long, or do you think people should, about 19% said within the first year they should apply for citizenship to be able to vote legally? Or do you think, but the bulk of them said, between 2 and 6 years, that's enough time to, assimilate, essentially? This is kind of a question about assimilation. Like, if you're going to live in the United States, should you go ahead and just, become an American citizen and have all the protections of all of our laws and be a voting member and all that?
That seems a little short for me, but it doesn't strike me as outlandish. Because I think what it does is it really reflects kind of the American sentiment of assimilation and integration. 2 to 6 years, like I said, 2 seems pretty short. But yeah, if somebody actually, and assuming the normal strictures apply in terms of citizenship tests and everything, I think that probably is a very credible number in that regard. I'd probably put it more like 5, just nice. I'd say a nice round number, but it's not. But
the other one that I thought was kind of striking is deportation. At least in the last 10 years or so, like talking about deporting illegals. Number one, it seems very to a lot of Americans, about 50 or generally about 50-60% of Americans, it seems very mean spirited, even though they're here breaking the law, and that usually is what happen to people who break the law. But from a policy standpoint, the idea of going out and quote unquote rounding up people and then deporting them, generally for Americans is kind of icky, for lack of a better word, even though they know that the enforcement of the law is important. However, with everything that's gone on the last 2 or 3 years, particularly under the Biden administration, with 7 to 9 million new illegals that have come across the borders and untold numbers of gotaways that they're not being honest about with the statistics, we're starting to see a change there. I thought this was a striking number, asking should the National Guard, military, and others deport most of the nearly 20 million illegals currently living in the United States. Should they deport them? 63% now say they favor deportation, and only 28% in this poll that was taken just last week, earlier this week. Only 28% oppose deportation.
Absent a new crime?
Correct. Yeah, this is just you're living in the country illegally.
Wow.
And they find you, or maybe they found you through a traffic stop or something like that. But the idea was, should the federal government be actively deporting people who are here illegally? 63% now say yes. 28% would oppose that.
That I do find I do find that shocking, just because of how much of a tide change that would represent from numbers that we'd seen that previously. But then again, I'm also sure that if you flavored that particular question with, given X crime, or let's even say like a class A, top tier misdemeanor, you'd probably in iterations past see a lot of people just say, it's really just not. But I think that just seeing like the absolute lack of order on the border, the absolute lack of assertion of our own sovereignty, It's shocking, but you can definitely find the antecedent for it. In the
Jonathan,
policy.
being in D.C., you have a front row to the dysfunction that is our federal government, and there's probably no issue on which they are more dysfunctional, save maybe the debt and spending, than immigration. Do you think that, I mean, from your seat, I know this isn't your number one issue, but from your seat, do you see any movement or progress, at least on the federal level, on any kind of breakthrough on border security or immigration?
Well, so I actually think that changing number is the way that we're going to get movement. And I think one of the things that's changed after, 3.5 years of wide open borders is that it's not just border states that are feeling the effects, right? And so I think when parents, when their children in public schools can't use the gymnasium because the gymnasium is being used to house migrants, all of a sudden they realize that there are consequences to these policies.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that on both sides of the aisle, the openness to deportation is increasing, I think that's going to create more appetite for a reform that some on the other side can support.
And I haven't dug through the crosstabs on this, but the fact that it's over 60% tells me that a lot of the movement there is going to be from independents and Democrats. Mm-hmm. It has to be, because Republicans have almost always been on the deportation side, 85%. So I'm interested to look through those and see how the Democrats in particular, or left-leaning folks, are moving on that issue. Okay, getting into our second segment, which we call Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. This is more of an issue that you care about, Jonathan. It is on education. Specifically here in Texas, we spend a ton of money on public education. Over the last, the research that I saw from our friends over at TCCRI, they looked at the last decade of between 2012 and 2022. Spending on public education has gone from $52 billion now. In 2022 is $85 billion. We just got numbers we talked about the other day. Now education spending in Texas is up to almost $93 billion, which that's just what we spend on public education, which is larger than the entire state budgets of 45 other states. Just what we spend on education is larger than the entire state budgets of 45 other states. And so we spend a ton of money. We're up to almost $18,000 per student now here in Texas. And the big question is, where does the money go? It's hard to find that answer out, but to the best of our ability, we see about 40% of it would go to what you would consider to be the classroom, in particular to teachers and teacher raises and teacher benefits. And about 60% goes into, stuff that just kind of keeps things rolling, keeps, the administration or facilities, or we have these huge bonds that we spend tons of money on to build stadiums and new facilities. Have you looked at that issue at all? Because that seems to be one of the number one ways, when we promote things like school choice or open enrollment or any of these kind of these reforms that are supposed to help and improve educational outcomes. The one thing the left always says is, well, we need more money, even though the statistics and the data shows that they have more money than ever. It's just not going in the right place. Have you found that in your research as well?
Yeah, so I don't study K-12, so I don't want to speak as an expert, but it seems to me that the incentives are wrong in K-12, just like they're wrong in higher ed. And so what we need to do is we need to create a situation in which families and teachers can be partners, where the people who are being educated, the kids, where their parents have some real say in what's being taught and who's teaching it. And I think that when you have that sort of local influence over what's happening in the classroom, the money will be spent in better ways, right? I mean, anytime you try to run a top-down system, you get worse results and tons of waste.
Derek, one of the things we experience here, according to TCCRI, is a huge growth in administrative growth and the number of people who were hired to essentially administer the school districts rather than putting money into the teachers. And it certainly is outpacing the student growth. So you've got this, 60-70% growth in administrative bloat, where you only have about a 6 to 7% increase in student growth.
Yeah, and obviously I'm no fan of the administrators by any means, but I will give them a to be fair point, in that some of that is externally determined, whether it's by the legislature, very rarely, but if it's by the legislature, or if it's something, a development in federal law or even federal regulation, administrative regulation, that's where you see a lot of that inflict. I should say a lot of that. That's where you see some of that inflicted. Now, the problem is, and the reason I think you bring that up is because the week-long garment rending session we saw on Twitter this week, where some backbencher, I can't remember who, sent an
in Texas.
Yeah, and this is like the mark of a very effective politician is writing a letter and then posting it on Twitter if that's where we're at. But did that basically calling attention to particular what they considered the underfunding arguments that we've heard.
Yeah.
Not looking at what are they spending on or what amount of the budget shortfall comes from COVID funds that dried up, what part of it came from other sort of non-academic things. But of course it's, we need to have the state pay more money. And I break this point every single time on this, is that the majority of the funding for local institutions, and this is the way they wanted it, and the way they wanted it all through the vast majority of Texas history, is they wanted local control on that taxing authority, and they wanted local control over the institution itself. Mm-hmm. So now they're coming, now that they're, you mentioned stadiums, water parks, private plane, all that whole stuff. Now they're coming and rattling a tin cup at the legislature because they do not have the taxing authority to blow out the budget so much as to cover all their pet projects. Mm-hmm. And that's where the issue comes to the fore, is that obviously the idiot bat signal went up, and that's where you have some golf coach from Stumblebum ISD now chirping at James Quintero or yourself, basically saying, they haven't increased the general allotment since 2019. There was a big increase in the general allotment in 2019, and that's state money.
Right.
That's state money, including the rapid growth of the actual tax rate up into the allowable percentage every single time. The fact that some of them need to go to special tax rate elections in order to actually satisfy their rampant spending just illustrates that it's not. They would rather do anything than cut the pay of the superintendent or focus on academics. Yeah. And that's, I think, very, very much evident in things we've seen.
Jonathan, our superintendents, we have 121 superintendents here in Texas that make over $250,000 a year, which puts them in the top 5% of all earners in the state. And this is the home state of the oil and gas industry. So that tells you that is a lot of money that those folks are making. All right, so we're going to go to our last thing. Speaking of energy, we're going to go to the last thing, what to look for in the future, what to look for coming up. My big thing to look for is going to be the grid. Mm-hmm. Obviously we're coming into the summer months. We have Memorial Day around the corner. Everybody's going to be ready, getting ready for summer, and school's going to be out. And so the big question is going to be, is the grid ready? It's always on the minds of folks. I think, the legislators feel confident. I know the governor feels confident, but it's always one of those things that we're going to be looking at to see if everything holds up, and make sure that, we have the power we need to going forward. So what about you in terms of what's coming up?
I'm looking forward to testing the limits of our PPO insurance coverage. We have our 50th anniversary and Old Boys game back in Cincinnati for my old rugby club. So we'll see if Curative works at various Ohio hospitals, which I'm sure I'll end up at following that.
Well, good luck to that.
On the work front, you mentioned the grid. We still have several hearings going on. But the interim charges came out from the House. Really looking forward to seeing specifically similar efforts like the monitoring of SB 17 was done in Senate Higher Ed. I'm looking forward to seeing where some of those other charges manifest.
All right. Well, we really, really appreciate Jonathan Pidluzny, the Director of Higher Education Reform, for being on the show today from AFPI. We, of course, looking forward, will continue to monitor the implementation of SB 17 and making sure those universities are complying with the law. So we will obviously keep an eye on that. And as always, thank you for our listeners, for our viewers. Of course, if you have any show topics or guests that you'd like us to feature, we would love those suggestions. You can find Derek and I both on the various social media platforms, or you can just contact us here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And as always, in the words of our founding father, Sam Houston, do good and risk the consequences. We'll see you next time.